Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Hi everyone. I just want to thank the Toronto chapter for inviting me to participate once again in this year's main Zeitgeist Day event. For those who have seen some of my previous lectures, I often like to explore different sides of or angles to what the Zeitgeist movement promotes in order to hopefully keep things interesting for myself and the audience, while still, of course, maintaining direct focus to the movement's advocacy initiatives and the train of thought we're attempting to put forward. So today, what I want to present with this talk is a slightly different philosophical angle by which to think about what the Zeitgeist movement promotes in terms of a natural law, resource-based economy. This talk is very much mirrored from the thesis of prominent neuroscientist Sam Harris's book called The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values. I will briefly summarize the thesis of the book, defend several of its premises, and respond to a few criticisms of what Harris is promoting. And then I will apply this framework of understanding to the Zeitgeist movement's social change initiatives. Why is this relevant? Firstly, the most popular ideas about moral systems usually involve either an objective religious standard decreed by a deity as part of a religious theology, or an appeal to moral relativism, usually from a secular perspective. I'll explain both in a moment. I think both are extremely flawed models. I think we are in deep need of an objective standard of morality from a secular, scientific perspective that aims to discern moral truths without the arbitrary, subjective basis of moral relativism. I think the relativistic standard is a dangerous one, as it can essentially be used to attempt to justify a broad range of destructive behaviors and values and social traditions under the guise that it is right according to that culture, or that it fits safely within the realm of personal choice that cannot be scrutinized for its social consequences. A science of morality would bypass this. A recent survey suggests that Americans are nowhere close to holding values that are grounded in scientific rationale. Check this out. 50% of people think engaging in homosexual behavior is morally wrong, an act that has literally no negative output on our social environment, and of course rather aids in human flourishing for people of such orientation. Look at all these actions considered morally wrong by what no doubt constitute a large portion of religious fundamentalists and/or conservatives. Looking at porn, smoking marijuana, living with someone when you're not married, and drinking alcohol are all considered morally wrong by a significant number of people. It seems that the religious sense of morality has nothing to do with harm reduction, but rather charm reduction. And secondly, without first understanding what could be termed a science of morality, there is actually no logical framework upon which we can promote a better world. Bear with me. In other words, we need an underlying goal that orients us towards the goals of sustainability, economic reform, and all the other things. This might sound like a bold claim, so let me get into it. In every definition of morality I've seen, it addresses questions of right and wrong or good and bad, always relating these ideas of moral or immoral actions to our well-being in some way. So if morality means anything relevant, it has to do with the well-being of conscious creatures, and likewise the inquiry into what will enhance or diminish this well-being or health. This is a question the scientific method can be used to address. In classical moral philosophy, for the most part, there is this separation between facts and values. That is, science can be used to determine physical facts about the universe, and moral systems are for determining questions of right and wrong, and that science cannot be used for the latter. This is the classical is-ought problem, that you cannot derive an ought from an is. This needs to be completely rethought, as the gap really is not as large as is often claimed. If the role of science is to establish facts about the physical nature of our universe, clearly that is inextricably linked to questions about what will enhance or detract from human flourishing. And thus, our scientific understanding can be used to differentiate between actions that contribute to more well-being and actions that contribute to less well-being, assuming, of course, that this is our goal. And I'll touch more upon that in a moment. A very simple analogy can be made to crystallize this point. We rely on empirical data about the physical world to prescribe the best possible approaches for human health. Not too many people would dispute the fact that there are better and worse ways to treat, for example, a cardiovascular event Just as the approach to treating human health is, or should be, absent monetary pressures, geared towards an evidence-based scientific approach, so too can morality be understood in terms of empirical information. And it doesn't matter that well-being is a somewhat vague term in our understanding of objective morality, any more than it matters that the somewhat vague term health impedes our ability to understand medicine. Both are constantly evolving and encompass a wide range of considerations. The idea of objective morality is in contrast to what is known as moral relativism, which is the idea that what is moral is dependent on the culture you're in. If you think about it, this sort of approach could be used to justify illimitable, dangerous ideas and outright atrocities themselves. So if we are to ascribe any useful, functional meaning to the word morality, again, it must relate to the well-being of conscious creatures. And this is not a culturally relative notion. In other words, this isn't subjective in any way. So what can be meant by objective morality, also called universal morality? Usually it refers to a standard of right and wrong or better and worse that is not contingent on culture or other subjective notions. Throughout history, this has been common amongst religious notions of morality, which are closer to making pronouncements about what is right and wrong, rather than describing a system for how we determine what is right and wrong. How would a secular version of objective morality look? It's very simple. No one likes to suffer, physically or emotionally. We can therefore deduce that suffering is bad from this obvious fact we all share. No one could honestly claim they enjoy suffering and maintain logical consistency, as the word and experience itself relate to the opposite of enjoyment. So what is at the root of all suffering or evil? I think I have an answer, 25.8069. You just take the square root of 666, and there you have it. In all seriousness now, a scenario which would entail the worst possible misery for everyone, as Sam Harris denotes, could safely be said to be the lowest possible position on a moral landscape, or if you prefer, a continuum that represents the well-being of conscious creatures. If you grant this one point, that the well-being of conscious creatures, that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, you now establish a continuum of moral rights and wrongs, or betters and worses, in which the peaks correspond to the height of well-being and the valleys correspond to the depths of misery. So, the moment you grant that the worst possible misery for everyone is the worst case scenario we can imagine, and that morality has to do with well-being, you have to admit there are better and worse ways to proceed with respect to morality, which is of course contingent on the laws of nature and the scientific method to uncover. So if we are at all to care about our well-being, the well-being of conscious creatures, if this is our goal, there are undoubtedly better and worse ways to achieve this end. If this is not our goal, the conversation is over and we actually have no basis for speaking about a better world. To speak about success, or achievement, or betterment, or improvement in any meaningful way means we have to define what our success actually is. For us to have a constructive conversation about anything, on some level, we have to have parallel goals. There's a difference between objective morality and absolute morality. The former refers to a process of discovering what will enhance well-being, while the latter generally refers to pronouncements about what is always good and always bad. For example, that lying is wrong. There may be exceptions to these pronouncements, given the circumstance. What objective morality could also be called, therefore, is situational morality, since what is right and wrong is completely contingent on the situation. Absolute morality does not account for this and is usually related to theological ideas of morality. For example, the distinction between food and poison is not weakened by the fact that some people have allergies to certain foods. Science has no problem identifying principles of nutrition simply because bodies respond to food in different ways. So let's take this concept a little further. The moral landscape feeds into what I will call the social landscape. How can we make pronouncements like increased efficiency and thus sustainability are desirable, or solving poverty is good, if we don't have an underlying goal implicit in our motives? This goal is to reduce or minimize suffering, and likewise to maximize social well-being. This is the whole point of the natural law, resource-based economy. So, while the Zeitgeist movement speaks out against patchwork solutions to solve social problems like law or morals, what I'm talking about is something different. You cannot superimpose a moral principle over a structure that reinforces values and behavior that run in opposition to this moral principle, just as laws do not prevent aberrant behavior from manifesting as it is socioeconomically induced. I'm talking about something different, though. I'm talking about the deepest underlying philosophical and moral foundation that is at the core of anyone's intention to ever improve society. They all share, and in fact, most of us share, this common goal to reduce suffering and maximize well-being. Again, I'll repeat this statement. The moment you grant that the worst possible misery for everyone is the worst case scenario we can imagine, and that morality has to do with well-being, you have to admit there are better and worse ways to proceed with respect to morality, which is of course contingent on the laws of nature and the scientific method to uncover. So likewise, the moment you define your goal as maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures, you likewise have to admit that there are better and worse ways to structure our society to achieve this goal. It seems that this is a goal most of us share on some level or another. Even the most diehard capitalist, I think, or at least would like to think, believes that the free market is truly the system that best serves humankind. They're provably wrong by countless empirical measures, but they do share the same goal as us. Let's try to keep this in mind as we go forward and we get into disagreements about what sort of social system is needed to move us forward as a species. I hope that I've shown that at least in principle, science can help us determine social arrangements that are better and worse for human flourishing, as well as for animals and the habitat we all rely on for survival. Even if we disagree on what that social system is, there have to be better and worse social systems that correspond to greater and lesser amounts of well-being. Since this is indeed a scientific question, it is one that can surpass the notion of cultural relativism or other ideologies and isms. Some specific examples to illustrate how this principle would likely play out in practice may be helpful. So let's consider just a few attributes or ingredients to what would make a social system more likely to lead to the enhancement of human flourishing. Number one, income inequality. The peer-reviewed scientific literature is very consistent on the epidemiological finding that the greater the degree of income inequality in a society, the more social problems will be prevalent. Though there are certainly notable exceptions, countless studies also indicate that upper-class individuals are less moral than middle and lower-class individuals in terms of empathy, willingness to lie and cheat to get ahead, the tendency to endorse unethical behavior in others, and so forth. It is clear that, in general, the higher in social class one becomes, the more indifferent they tend to become with respect to social well-being. We can thus deduce that a social system that alleviates or completely removes the basis for such disparities will be more conducive to enhancing well-being than a social system predicated on competition and consequently income inequality. This is a scientifically sound and thus morally justified conclusion. Number two, competition versus cooperation in terms of incentive and motivation. Scientific research is also very clear that competitive structures tend to inhibit innovation due to the extrinsic motivators acting as a disincentive for creativity. And likewise, they tend to decrease efficiency through the withholding of information. Therefore, a social system which removes the basis or necessity for people to compete in as many areas as possible would be optimal. 3, automation versus labor for income. The market system's requirement of labor for income means that a great majority of people are coerced into jobs that they would most likely not choose if they were free to pursue their genuine passions and interests. A social system that seeks to increase human well-being, which includes being free of obligation to submit to mindless or pointless labor, would seek to automate as many of these jobs as possible and free humans to pursue their true and deepest desires. And 4, sustainable practices. It is pretty much an axiomatic principle of the applied sciences to build structures with as much technical efficiency and integrity as possible. Yet systemic pressures on numerous levels inhibit this process to the extent that cheap, inferior materials are used that compromise optimum design. This in turn translates into lots of waste and tremendous inefficiency, greatly negatively affecting the well-being of most people on the planet. It should seem obvious that a social system that strives to maximize our global well-being should be designed at the core of operational function to be as sustainable as possible. As you can see, a natural law, resource-based economy puts into practice all of these scientific understandings, both the technical and sociological. It is the very embodiment of applying our best understandings that relate to what works in achieving maximal human flourishing or well-being. This is not to say that science has all the answers, or that science should dictate the minutiae of our individual choices. Even though in principle, with enough information, science could discover such truths. But since we're talking about all aspects of well-being, physical, emotional, psychological, intellectual, I think it is safe to assume that a social system that grants its inhabitants the highest degree of individual freedom within the bounds of natural law and general sustainability protocols would be one that maximizes flourishing in this regard. Now I want to briefly go over a few main questions or objections that generally get brought up in conjunction with this topic, most of which I've touched upon already, and then I'll wrap up. Objection 1. You cannot use facts about the physical world to determine how we should act. I've touched upon this already, but let's touch on it again and drill the point in. Philosopher David Hume in the 1700s is famous for describing the seeming gap between is, a fact about the physical universe, and ought, how humans should behave. It is a wonder how this idea still persists. The only point you need to grant is that suffering is bad, and more so, that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. If such a situation could not be considered bad, the word bad really is meaningless. If we grant this, a moral imperative surfaces, that we should avoid suffering, and hence by reverse interpolation, we should maximize well-being and flourishing. Since our well-being is inextricably linked to facts about the physical world, such as how we treat the environment, what optimum nutrition means, our social structure, and so forth, how we should behave can be logically deduced from these facts. And this is how we get our ought from is. No, this is not a naturalistic fallacy, as the mere existence of a phenomenon in nature does not mean that we should mirror our behavior or our society after it. The question is how these phenomena relate to our well-being. Now, some people will say, sadly, I agree with that, but science cannot tell me what my goal ought to be in the first place. This is a superficial argument. Again, I guarantee you, you do not like to suffer. Some people can say they enjoy pain, maybe they're a sadomasochist or something, but that is not suffering then. Since no one enjoys suffering by definition of the word, your implicit goal is to avoid it and to attempt to maximize your well-being. The more we learn about the social sciences, the more we understand that people's well-being is directly tied to the well-being of everyone else, which really shows you that the best way to maximize your own well-being is to work towards a society that takes care of everyone to the best of our possibilities. Then some people will undoubtedly say, okay, fine, but I don't agree with your definition of morality. Who says it has to do with well-being? I've actually already addressed this, so I won't belabor the point, but just to redress, every dictionary definition I've read of morality includes principles of right and wrong behavior. If we accept our basic premise that the worst possible suffering for everyone is bad, this is our philosophical bedrock upon which moral truths can be discerned. The branch of study known as modern-day physics has to do with describing facts about the physical world. If someone were to redefine physics in the context of, say, what the Bible has to say about physics, they're simply wrong in their definition, and that person doesn't get to participate in any meaningful discussion about physics. Same with morality. If you think morality means something arbitrary, like following religious declarations of what is considered moral regardless of the justification, or following some Ayn Randian free market notion of morality, you are now talking about something out of the domain of human well-being, and thus not truly discussing morality. Objection 2, moral conundrums. There are many classical hypotheticals that are often brought up to attempt to illustrate the difficulty in assessing the morally best answer to a given situation. I won't deviate into examples here, but suffice it to say, these will always exist. What I'm arguing is that these answers exist in principle, even though they may be difficult to arrive at in practice. This is, of course, no different to other fields of science. Biologists today still cannot fully account for abiogenesis, how life originated on Earth. Yet they do not doubt that there is an explanation, and that we may figure it out in the future. If anything, applying a scientific, empirical framework to many of these difficult moral questions may make them easier to solve, as we can better quantify the net consequences of an action than if we were to rely on a more subjective, relativistic notion or other traditional notions of morality. Objection 3, one that may spring to Zeitgeist movement-oriented people that I've touched on. You cannot superimpose a moral code on top of a system that reinforces immoral behavior. True. A major criticism of the Zeitgeist movements on our current methods of solving social problems are the patchwork approaches to attempting to solve these social problems. Legal and moral impositions being two of the main ones. If your system causes gross social distortions, then that is what your system is structurally designed to do. You cannot just take a syringe and inject morals into your socioeconomic system, thinking that this type of moral instruction will be enough to counter the inherently negative effects produced by the system. But that isn't what I'm describing here today. I'm talking about the opposite, not that morality should be imposed on top of a socioeconomic system, but that we have a viable moral foundation for our socioeconomic system. What I'm advocating for is that the validity of our values is quantifiable by an empirical benchmark, meaning science, in the sense that they are more or less moral. In other words, whether our values lead to greater or lesser amounts of well-being. Again, if morality means anything, it relates to the well-being of conscious creatures. And since all our values, behaviors, preferences, thoughts, and so forth are not inconsequential, in principle, they can in some way be quantified as more or less moral. In other words, they work better or less with respect to our collective well-being. A natural law, resource-based economy is a social system that is arranged in a structure that will best be able to maximize this well-being through various empirical social measures I brought up. I'm going to leave it there with the objections. There is a litany of moral philosophy that we could take hours and hours to deconstruct, but it is really irrelevant to the point of this talk. Let's summarize and wrap up. Suffering is universally bad. From this fact, we derive a goal imperative that we should strive to avoid suffering and aim toward well-being or flourishing of conscious creatures. Since morality relates to well-being, and since science relates facts about the physical world that affect our well-being, there are more moral and less moral ways, or rather better and worse behaviors, values, and circumstances that can exist to influence the well-being of conscious creatures. A moral landscape thus exists in which the worst possible suffering for everyone is the worst case scenario and embodies the deepest valley, where the height of flourishing would be the highest peak, and where a nearly infinite number of scenarios exist in between. Going a little further, this moral imperative suggests the need for a substantial revision to our social system, one that is actually structurally designed at its core to maximize well-being. A natural law, resource-based economy is such a system which strives to maximize the well-being of conscious creatures to the highest state that's technically possible from the immutable natural laws that science has continually uncovered. Why is this important? Morality today is generally thought of as culturally subjective or theologically objective. This obscures facts about the physical world that affect our well-being and thus blinds us from thinking about moral questions in light of science, which is desperately needed. Without an underlying goal that orients us towards social practices that strive to maximize well-being or flourishing, there is no empirical foundation for which to think about such needed changes. I hope to have provided that for you today. Thank you very much.